A low hum filled the air, mingling with the evening breeze that whispered through the thorny foliage of Mia's hiding place. The undergrowth pricked at her skin, tiny points of pain that grounded her, kept her breath steady, her senses sharp. She crouched low, her limbs folded under her, eyes trained on the path below, where strange prints marked the dry earth, wide, deep tracks too big for any creature she knew from her world. This wasn't my choice, she reminded herself, forcing the thought through her mind as if repetition alone would make it true. But survival, she knew, left little room for sentiment. Her people had sent her to this alien place with promises that it was uninhabited, a world that would sustain her, hidden from the dangers of her war-torn home. But what did it matter now? The more she learned of this place, the more it felt alive with the unknowable. Lurking predators, unspoken histories, sounds that echoed in the dark without source or reason. The only certainty was her need to remain unseen. Suddenly, her eyes caught a flash of movement below. She leaned forward, barely daring to breathe. The figure stepped into view, unmistakably unlike the animals she'd been watching from her hollow for days. Tall and upright, its form rippled with powerful muscles beneath its clothing, with limbs that moved in calculated smooth motions as it scanned the area. Her heart hammered against her ribs. It's here to hunt me. The thought alone made her dig her fingers into the earth, eyes fixed on the creature below. She watched him. Or was it a him? Unsure but mesmerized, she noted his hair was closely cropped, and his skin gleamed under the low light, shadows catching on the rough contours of his jaw and the pronounced line of his shoulders. But it was his eyes, piercing and bright even in the gathering twilight, that held her attention. They moved with purpose, the gaze of a hunter, fierce and unyielding. He knows, she thought, a shiver of certainty running through her. He knows I'm here. She watched as he moved closer, his footfalls too careful, deliberate, as if every step was guided by unseen knowledge. Her breath shallowed, and she drew herself tighter into the thorny brush, feeling the prickling branches press into her skin. But he stopped short, his head tilting slightly, and for a fleeting moment his expression softened, confusion replacing that fierce intensity. He lowered his head, looking down at the ground, his hands reaching out to push aside a branch in his path. She saw the pause in his movement, the barely perceptible hesitation, and in that heartbeat she felt a strange sensation stirring deep within her, some intuition she couldn't name or explain, a glimmer of something beyond fear. Was he lost? But that fleeting thought was gone as quickly as it came, shattered by the sound of a low growl that came from her right. Her gaze shot toward the noise, and she froze, recognizing the shadow slipping from the trees as one of the large native predators she'd been warned of. A creature with a mottled hide, a jaw filled with jagged, gleaming teeth, and eyes trained on her hiding spot. It had found her. The beast prowled forward, the heavy lines of muscle rippling beneath its dark fur, its every movement imbued with a terrifying, quiet power. She could see the way its body coiled, ready to spring, and the flash of its teeth as it snarled, head low and focused on her. Panic tightened her throat and her body went rigid. "Stay silent," she commanded herself. "Don't move." But it was too late. The creature let out a feral roar, the sound tearing through the quiet. She shut her eyes, every nerve in her body braced for the onslaught, and then, in the span of a single heartbeat, everything changed. A sudden rustling, a burst of movement. Her eyes flew open, and there, blocking the creature's path, was the human. His posture was taut, and his gaze fierce. She watched, disbelief rooting her in place as he stood between her and the beast, his back to her, shoulders squared against the looming threat. The creature lunged, claws flashing, jaws open wide, and in one swift, precise motion, he stepped to the side, dodging the attack. His hand shot out, catching the beast's fur with a grip that looked deceptively gentle, before his arm twisted with brutal efficiency, sending the creature off balance. It crashed to the ground, snarling, but he was. Relentless, moving like water, unyielding, his stance was stone, his every strike calculated, his every move sure. For the first time since her exile, Mary forgot to hide. She forgot the rules drilled into her since she was a child, about the dangers of the unknown, about the importance of silence, of self-preservation. She watched, entranced, as he fought off the predator with a strength and skill that defied reason. When at last the creature stumbled back, wounded and weary, it let out a defeated snarl before retreating into the shadows. The silence that followed felt both deafening and fragile, like glass that could shatter with the slightest sound. He turned, his breathing heavy, his eyes, those fierce, impossibly clear eyes, locked onto hers. She felt the weight of his gaze, saw the bewilderment mirrored there, a confusion that echoed her own. "Are you?" His voice was softer than she expected, resonant and low. He took a step forward, his expression shifting as he looked at her, taking in the evidence of her fear, the tangle of her hair, the rawness in her eyes. "Are you hurt?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. Her mind raced, logic clashing with the reality of what had just unfolded. This human, this carnivorous predator of legend, the very thing she'd been warned to avoid, had saved her life. She shook her head slowly, more out of disbelief than denial. Her voice, when it finally came, was a raw whisper. "Why?" He looked at her as though he didn't understand the question, and maybe he didn't. But then, slowly, a faint smile touched his lips, the kind that held both amusement and something almost like sorrow. "Because you were in danger," he said simply. And with that he stepped back, giving her space, leaving her standing there in the wake of his words, her heart pounding with confusion, gratitude, and an inexplicable sense of longing. This opening draws the reader into Mary's predicament, her trepidation toward humans, and the shocking discovery that this strange, carnivorous human is perhaps not the danger she feared. It establishes a suspenseful, layered tone that will build as Mary's connection to this human grows, introducing complexities and challenges to her beliefs and instincts. Mary couldn't move, couldn't speak. She just watched as he took another step back, as if he understood the distance she needed to feel safe, the space that would give her mind room to process what had just happened. She knew she should run, slip away before he could change his mind, or worse, realize she wasn't entirely like him. But her legs felt anchored, rooted by some unseen force. She was curious. "You're not like the others." The words slipped out before she could stop herself, barely a whisper, but loud enough for him to hear. She winced, feeling the weight of her admission settle between them, thick as smoke. He didn't look surprised, though. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if trying to study her from a new angle, his expression softening. "I could say the same about you." She swallowed hard, suddenly aware of the delicate skin on her wrists, the faint pulse in her neck, the way her breathing gave her away. Was it fear or something else? She wasn't used to this closeness, this intensity of being seen. "What are you?" he asked, voice low and even. There was no accusation in it, only a quiet curiosity that made her feel as if he truly wanted to understand. Not dissect, not judge, just know. Mary struggled to find the words. Her own language seemed too foreign here, and she knew from observing humans that her features were different enough. They'd know. They'd always know. But somehow, in his gaze, she felt a flicker of courage. She began, searching for something he might grasp, something he could comprehend, without shattering whatever fragile moment they shared. "Not from here." He didn't recoil, didn't break eye contact. If anything, his gaze only sharpened, his brow knitting with something like concern. Not from here? You mean you don't belong here? He asked, his voice a murmur, as if he were afraid of frightening her away with his questions. She nodded, feeling the tension that had knotted in her shoulders relax by the smallest fraction. I was sent here. Her voice quivered, each word falling like a stone in water, heavy and uncertain. Not by choice. He blinked, processing her admission. She could see it in his eyes. That calculation humans so often relied on. The wheels of understanding turned within him, but then he seemed to set it aside, at least for now, his gaze softening as he took in her dishevelled state. You're hurt, he observed, a simple statement. Something in her recoiled at his attention, at the raw vulnerability that her bloodied, scraped arms betrayed. It's nothing, she muttered, pulling herself back with an effort, the instinct to shield herself surfacing. You can't let them see you as weak, her elders had taught her. Weakness invites danger. But he didn't reach for her, didn't press the issue. Instead, he only nodded, glancing around the darkening forest. There's a stream not far from here, clean water. You could wash up if you want. His voice was tentative, as if he knew that any suggestion, any hint of help, might send her fleeing into the shadows. And yet, despite herself, she nodded, feeling something inside her loosen, like an old wound that hadn't fully healed until now. She watched as he took a few careful steps, moving ahead to lead the way, though he kept his distance, always glancing back to make sure she followed. The forest was thick, the trees towering and gnarled, their branches clawing at the sky. She walked silently behind him, listening to the rhythmic crunch of his footsteps on the leaves, the way his head would tilt slightly with each sound that broke the quiet. Even his movements seemed measured, as though he carried some unspoken awareness of his surroundings, an instinct she hadn't expected. When they reached the stream, he stopped at the bank and stepped aside, gesturing to the water with an open hand. It's safe, he said, his voice soft. You're safe here. She looked at him, feeling the weight of his words settle over her like a thin blanket, barely warm, but enough to stave off the cold. The silence between them stretched thick and heavy, punctuated only by the murmur of water over smooth stones. After a moment's hesitation, she stepped forward and crouched by the stream, dipping her hands into the cool water, watching as the ripples distorted her reflection. She could see herself in fragments, pieces of her face distorted by the moving current, strange, almost alien. She scrubbed at the dirt and dried blood on her arms, wincing as the cold water bit into the scrapes. But she kept at it, working in silence until her skin was clean, the worst of her wounds stinging, but manageable. He watched her, his gaze steady but respectful, as if he understood that she needed this moment. And perhaps he did. When she finally looked up, his eyes met hers, a flicker of something she couldn't quite name passing between them. You don't look like anyone I've met, he said carefully, his voice so quiet she had to strain to hear him over the water. There was no malice in his tone, only a quiet curiosity that made her feel exposed, yet strangely accepted. She shrugged, as if she could brush off the weight of his scrutiny. And you're not what I expected, she replied, her own voice a whisper, the admission leaving her feeling raw and vulnerable. He nodded, the faintest smile tugging at the corners of his lips. I get that a lot. They lapsed into silence again, the air between them thick with unspoken questions, tentative connections, and a fragile trust that felt as if it could break at any moment. But then, as if sensing the tension, he spoke again, his voice gentle. I don't know who sent you here or why, he said slowly, as if choosing his words with care. But if you're in trouble, if someone's looking for you, there are places you can hide, places I could show you. His words made her heart stutter, the sheer kindness of his offer hitting her like a blow. She looked at him, her eyes narrowing with suspicion, the instinct to protect herself rearing up, even as a strange warmth spread through her chest. "Why?" she demanded, her voice sharper than she intended. "Why would you help me?" He held her gaze, his own eyes dark and steady. "Because I don't think anyone should be alone out here," he replied simply. There was something vulnerable in his expression, a flicker of emotion he seemed to guard closely, but she saw it all the same. "And because, maybe I know what it's like to run from something." She stared at him, her mind spinning as she tried to process his words, the quiet intensity of his gaze, the unexpected depth behind his offer. Her thoughts tangled, conflicting instincts warring within her as she fought to make sense of the connection that seemed to bind them, tenuous yet undeniable. Finally she looked away, her voice a barely audible murmur. "Thank you," she said, the words foreign on her tongue but somehow right, "for everything." He inclined his head, acknowledging her words with a nod, his gaze warm but unobtrusive, as if he understood that she wasn't ready to give more than that. Not yet. As the stars began to blink into the night sky, she found herself wondering, for the first time since her exile, if perhaps there was a chance, small, fragile, but real, that she might survive in this world. With his help, maybe she could be more than just a stranger, more than a fugitive. Maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to belong. This continuation delves further into the unfolding dynamic between Mary and her mysterious savior, exploring their mutual vulnerability and the burgeoning trust between them. The dawn broke over the hilltops, casting golden light across the quiet clearing where Mary and her companion, now known as Ken, stood side by side. They watched the sun climb, both knowing that the next few hours would alter their lives irrevocably. After months in hiding, they'd been found. A band of mercenaries was closing in, sent by those who'd exiled her. She could still hear the ominous hum of their ships in the distance. Her time was up. Ken glanced over at her, his face a mask of determination and something else, a sadness so raw and fierce that it made her heart clench. "You don't have to stay with me," she said, her voice quiet, though her heart shouted in protest. She knew she couldn't ask him to fight alongside her, not when he'd already given her so much. But he didn't move. Instead, he reached out, his fingers brushing her arm in a gesture that spoke of all the moments they'd shared, all the things they'd never said. "Mary," he murmured, his voice hoarse, "I knew what I was risking the day I decided to stay with you." He looked into her eyes, his gaze steady. "I wouldn't be here if I didn't believe in you." In us, a shiver ran down her spine as his words settled over her, grounding her, even as everything else felt as though it was slipping away. For the first time, she truly believed that maybe, somehow, they could survive this, that this fragile connection they'd built could outlast even the sharpest edges of her exile. The mercenaries appeared in the clearing, their leader stepping forward, gun raised. His expression was cold and calculating, but Mary met his gaze with a newfound courage, one that had grown through every challenge, every shared heartbeat with Ken. "Stand down, or I'll shoot," the mercenary growled, but Ken stepped forward, his stance unwavering. "If you want her, you'll have to go through me," the mercenary sneered. "A human defending an alien? What a pathetic sight." Yet as the mercenaries closed in, Mary raised her hand, feeling a pulse of energy she hadn't felt in years, a remnant of the power she thought she'd lost. And beside her, Ken's hand tightened on his weapon, his loyalty unwavering. In a burst of courage, they fought side by side, each movement as synchronized as if they were one. The mercenaries faltered, unprepared for the fierce resilience of the pair, and one by one, they fell. When the dust settled, only the mercenary leader remained. He stumbled backward, fear in his eyes, before disappearing into the woods, defeated. Breathless, Mary and Ken stood in the silence, each wounded but alive. She looked up at him, tears glistening in her eyes. "You stayed," she whispered, barely able to believe it. He brushed a thumb across her cheek, a gentle, grounding touch. "I told you," he said. "Wherever you go, I'll be there." He leaned closer, his voice a murmur. "You're my home now, Mary." And in that moment, beneath the dawning sky, they knew they'd found something worth fighting for. Together, they would face whatever came, their bond stronger than exile, stronger than fear. As they walked away from the clearing side by side, a new path stretched before them, one they would carve together, wherever it led. And for the first time since her exile, Mary felt that she had found a place to belong. This ending brings Mary and Kian's journey to a heartfelt conclusion, with the promise of more adventures and an undeniable bond between them. They both found strength in each other, overcoming isolation and exile, leaving the audience with a sense of hope and fulfillment.